distinguishes the different mobile brands for the users in terms of how they see what they're getting?
Several things. One point of distinctivity is, where is the brand from? Safaricom has been able to make good inroads to become the dominant player in the market because it is seen as a global company. Secondly, they are leaders in innovation, and they have very many value-added services. So the more value-added services that a telco has, the greater distinctivity. And thirdly, it is also the way that these mobile brands communicate their value-added services. If I look at the history of the telecommunications industry over the past 10 years, there are cases where players like Cancel, which later became Celtel, which changed to Zain and now Airtel, were the first to launch some products in the market, but they communicated these brands in a way which did not resonate with Kenyans. But when Safaricom launched the same products using local names, and they communicated better. And
when you say local, you mean in Swahili as opposed to English?
Yes, in Swahili. For instance, the sharing of airtime from one user to another on the prepaid platform. Celtel launched it first and they called it Me to You. When Safaricom launched it, they called it Sambaza. With time, Sambaza became a buzzword, not just as far as telecoms is concerned, but on other issues of day-to-day life.
Conversation, yeah. And in terms of what the mobile companies do to distinguish themselves, what in all this spending stands out in terms of what makes one different from the other in terms of people's minds?
I look at the market leader. Year on year, they spend a lot of money in marketing. One thing which they did differently is they came up with a signature event, which is what other successful multinationals globally have done. For instance, Standard Chartered have the annual Nairobi Marathon, which is part of the greatest race on earth series. Safaricom came up with the idea of conservancy, and they sponsored the Law Marathon, which is a charitable run and giving back to society and the local community. So in that way, they were able to differentiate themselves. With the other players, beyond above the line advertising, there is nothing much they do which distinguishes them.
Yeah. So, in terms of the wider East Africa, how do the brands play out across the rest of the East African countries like Uganda and Tanzania and other places?
In Uganda, the leading telco is MTN. In Uganda, it's Vodacom, which is part of Vodafone. In Kenya, it's Safaricom, which is partially owned by the government, partially owned by Vodafone, and partially owned by the Kenyan public. We have a situation of dominance in each of the three markets. We don't have a close number two in any of those markets. There's a dominant player and other small players.
So is there no challenger strategy amongst those brands that are not dominant?
They could have a challenger strategy, but it's not coming through clearly. And with a market which is not expanding as far as user base, what the other challengers have been trying to do is to eat into existing market share. In Kenya, there's one player who started a price war, but it did not work. What they expected to get did not go through. They did that not just in Kenya, but across the African continent. Some time back.
So this is Airtel who started the...
Yes, it is Airtel who started it. Everybody else followed suit. But to maintain stickiness, the dominant players across East Africa came up with products, or they already had products, which made it very difficult for the consumer to move completely from one player to another. So this led to a situation whereby, other than move completely from my current provider, I'll get a second SIM card.
So lots of people have more than one SIM card.
Yes.
And what are these sticky products, these value-added services that are proving successful for the dominant players?
The loyalty programs. But the most significant one is mobile money transfer. Mobile money by MTN in Uganda and M-Pesa in Kenya.
Okay. And in terms of we've referred earlier to Airtel, which has gone through something like 4 rebrandings. How do people remember it? Because people still say to me, talk about Celtel or talk about Zain, to the previous names.
It's been very, very confusing.
Yes.
Because by the time a name sticks to in the mind of the consumer, a lot has to be done. It's not just a question of changing the colors, changing the logo, and rebranding. What I think the principles of this company need to understand is that a brand is a relationship. A brand is something which lives in the mind of the consumer. It is not something which you pick off the shelf. It is a relationship, and it takes time to build this relationship. So with a relationship which keeps changing, and you can not identify or know who your spouse is or was, it's going to take some time before they make serious inroads in the African market.
And what do you think the consumer's experience of the brand is? Because my experience as a consumer here in Nairobi is that often very poor quality of service in terms of signal, quite often quite crowded customer service centres. If you ring the call centres, they're always busy. What's against all this spend, what's the experience of the consumer?
The amazing thing about the Kenyan consumer, the African consumer, is that he is very forgiving.
Right.
And
so low expectations.
Low expectations, but having a cell phone in hand is already a great milestone. Because for a long time, and up until now, we have had very poor terrestrial infrastructure. It used to take between 3 and 6 months to apply for landline because the telecom company was not efficient. But if you could pick up a SIM card and insert it in your cell phone and you start talking, you can live with a bad signal because you've come from 0.0 to some level of communication. But with time, the Kenyan consumer or the African consumer is becoming more and more demanding.
And how quickly do you think that process will take?
That process was going to take not long, maybe a few years. But I'm afraid in my assessment, I think it will take much longer because the price wars which were introduced into the market by Airtel have put less money in the hands of the telcos. So in terms of infrastructure in investment, they have less money, and they've got to cut back on costs to maintain profitable operations. So it was a double-edged sword. They looked at one side of the coin. They wanted to mop up consumers. What I don't think they considered was that they need money to invest, and cost cutting. They might get you the consumer, but they will not speak. They will not talk for more, and it can backfire like it did. They need to move up the customers they had, so they're finding themselves in a situation whereby liquidity is a problem.
And in terms of the mobile brand, what's the next biggest brand in Kenyan or East African terms that compare in terms of scale of advertising expenditure?
There is an NGO, which is Population Services International, which is funded by USAID, TFID, and other international donors. They are close second to Safaricom.
Okay.
And third is Coca-Cola.
Thank you very much for talking to me today, Sammy.
Thank you, Russell.